This episode of the Vocal Minority Report is brought to you by Audible.com. Go to audible.com/vocal report for your free audiobook download and 30-day trial. That's audible.com/vocal report. Previously on the Vocal Minority.
Are you part of the silent majority? Or are you part of the vocal minority?
Motherfuckers, go! Attention, please!
If America can be saved, and I don't know if it's too late, but it'll be to a radio show like this new kind.
My name is Jamie Broadnax of Black Girl Nerds, and I am with the Vocal Minority Podcast.
This shit here feels like the whole entire world collapse. Motherfucker!
The revolution will not be televised, will not be televised, will not be televised, will not be televised. The revolution will be no rerun, brothers.
It's the vocal minority.
The revolution will be live.
Welcome to another episode of the Vocal Minority Report. It's your boy MC. As always, you could have downloaded any podcast in the world, but you're here with us. We appreciate that. Our guest today is a short fiction author and host of one of the most popular sci-fi podcasts, The Geeks Guide to the Galaxy by Wired.com. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome David Barr Kirtley to the show.
Hey guys, thanks for having me.
I really appreciate you coming on. How's it going for you today?
Good. No, I'm really happy to be on this show. I'm really, as I said, honored to be a guest.
No, that's awesome, man. I appreciate it. I'm honored to have you. You certainly know about guests, and you've had on a high caliber of guests, so I'm glad to add you to our list here. I want to talk to you about a lot of stuff here. I want to get into your podcast and talk about your show, because I know if, like, our producer, Deanne, she is a big fan of it, and there's some other people that I know that are really into it. I'm not a huge sci-fi person, but I want to get into that a little bit. But I want to talk to you about, because I believe I'm excited to listen to your next episode, because you're going to be talking about Black Mirror, right?
Yep. We recorded it. I just turned it in yesterday, and we'll be talking about season 3 of Black Mirror. And I have three friends of mine who did a really great job. Raphael Jordan, Anthony Ha, and Natalie Zuter. Actually, she's on for the first time, but she's reviewing the show for Tor.com. And Raphael is a working screenwriter in Hollywood. So they just, brought a lot of knowledge and enthusiasm to the discussion.
Now that's cool. I watched episodes 2 and 3 last night. I just happened to, because I like the show, and I was really into season 1. Season 2, I feel like I can't remember season 2 as much for some reason. At episode 1, it was good, but 2 and 3, like I like that 2. I think that's the one with Cooper, where the guy. Yeah, that one was a trip. So anyway, I'm sure you guys break them up. So do you guys go over every episode on your episode that's coming out, or how deep do you guys get into it?
Well, so it's a 90-minute episode, and there are 6 episodes, so that's 15 about 15 minutes per episode. And so we go pretty deep. I give a little plot summary at the beginning, and then people give their response. It's sort of a review. And since Raphael's a screenwriter, people have different suggestions for maybe how they would have tweaked the story if they were writing it. That's really what our approach in the show is to be as hardcore as possible and to go as deep as possible and think things through and take science fiction very seriously.
Can't wait to listen to that, because the Black Mirror, after the first season, that episode 1, I was so hooked with the pig.
That was unlike anything I've ever seen. I was absolutely just riveted. You're just sitting there like, I can't believe what I'm watching right now. It was so good. Just the different turns the plot takes and the psychological complexities. I just thought that was outstanding. Yeah.
So, and I guess I should say that Black Mirror is a show on Netflix. I guess it's a Netflix. Is it a Netflix series?
Season 3. It was originally a British show, but season 3 is on Netflix.
Okay, cool. Yeah, no, Netflix found because I feel like I watched season 1 a couple years ago, and I think it came out a while ago, and I've tried to get everyone I know to watch it. So I've probably seen it about 6 or 7 times, because I make people watch that. So anyway, people should check out Black Mirror on Netflix, and then certainly listen to your episode. Well, cool. So all right. So then you kind of mentioned it there, or started to mention it there, as far as kind of going deep and into certain topics on your show. So I want to get into your podcast, Geeks Guide to the Galaxy. So what else can you tell us about your show? So for those who aren't aware of your highly acclaimed show.
Well, yeah. So, I mean, the show's been going for almost 7 years. We're on episode 227 right now.
Congratulations, by the way, because I mean that's in podcast years. That's an extremely long time for one, especially for the same show, and to have gained that traction and to still be around and evolve. So that's and at 200, that's a hell of a library too. So no, that's a heck of a thing. So anyway, sorry about that. Go ahead.
Oh, no, thanks. It's funny because I've started going to podcasting networking events, which have started cropping up in New York City where I live. And I just tell people that I've been doing the podcast for 7 years. And most of the people I meet just can't believe it. You know, they've just been doing it for 6 months, or they're just about to start, or, you know,
right.
They're like, were there even podcasts 7 years ago? I just started hearing about it recently, you know, so.
I think the evolution of podcasts in that 7 years is really interesting too, because when I first started listening to podcasts, it was probably about 7 years ago. And that was really just it wasn't shows like yours or what we do now, what I do now. It was more of, hey, here's a talk radio segment that they then put on the internet, or a best of recap show was more, it'd be like PTI, it was something like that, the deep, it took me a while to get into the kind of deeper, all the additional content like your show out there. So I think it's, so for guys like you who I just, that longevity is pretty good. So.
Well, I mean, it's funny because, I mean, podcast had been going for about 4 years, I think, before we started ours. I was really lucky because I'm a science fiction author, you mentioned, and some of my science fiction short stories had been adapted for some of the early fiction podcasts like Escape Pod and Pseudopod. And
okay.
So that's how I kind of heard about podcasting. So I sort of got into it way before I think most people were familiar with it. This is back when you had to plug your iPod into the computer and manually move each file over and things like that. So, you had to really be dedicated back then to do it.
That's crazy. Just the idea of an iPod, even sounds weird. I mean, just those words I haven't thought about. I had my little teal, I think in 2004, it was a teal, maybe like 8 gig or 16 gig iPod, maybe. I don't know. It's like thinking about a record player cassette tape.
Yeah.
It seems so long ago. Okay, so podcast, and you 4 years into it, so your shows were adapted, and then that prompted you some of your stories were adapted into those first ones. So that prompted you to, like, what was your initial thought, and then I guess we can talk about the kind of evolution from day one. I know it seems like you're always asked a lot of questions about your podcast evolution, where things are going, but I'm more interested in getting your setup and then the trajectory from kind of where you evolved from episode 0, the initial thought, to 200 plus here.
Yeah. So as I mentioned, I mean, some of my stories had been adapted for podcasts. And so I started just listening to podcasts, and I was really so into it because I was always so frustrated growing up being interested in science fiction books and PC games and things like that. There wasn't anything on television or on radio really talking about the things that I was most passionate about. And so when it came to podcasts, there were just these very specialized niche podcasts. Like there was a science fiction talk show. I mean, it's still going, but back then one of the only ones was this one called Starship Sofa. It was done by these two guys in Newcastle in the UK. And I just listened to every single episode of that. And so I was just a serious hardcore addict. I was just listening. I mean, I was listening to hundreds and hundreds of podcast episodes. And my best friend in New York is this guy, John Joseph Adams. And he's gone on to become a very prominent fantasy and science fiction editor. He has his own book line at Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. And he's the owner and publisher of Lightspeed and Nightmare magazines, which are two prominent magazines, fiction and articles and things in the field. And so we were hanging out a lot in New York. He used to live in New York. He's moved, but we were hanging out a lot in New York, and he had gotten into editing anthologies. He just edited 2 short fiction anthologies. So it's a book with stories by different authors. And the second one he did was called The Living Dead. And this was just at the beginning of when zombie stuff was just skyrocketing in popularity. And it was a zombie anthology. And so it became very, very popular, and it almost hit the New York Times bestseller list. And I had written one of the stories for this book. And so he and I were just going around to all these zombie, events talking about this book. and being interviewed and things like that. And so we did an interview on WBAI, on Jim Freund's Hour of the Wolf radio show. And we got out of that. And the show's, it's like at 4 a.m. or something. And so we get out at 6 a.m. The sun's just coming up. And John says, "Oh, I wish we could keep talking about the book because I have so many more things I still want to say." And I said, "Well, if we had our own show, we could just talk as much as we wanted to. And, we would, we'd never have to stop." And
a podcast was born. Okay.
Yeah. And so at that time, John had been writing articles for Tor.com, which is the website of Tor Books, which is the largest fantasy and science fiction book publisher. So he had a relationship with the editor of Tor.com. And so he just pitched that person, his name is Pablo Defendidi, on the idea of us doing a podcast for them. And Pablo said, sure. And so we started doing it. And we had never done any podcasting or anything like that before. So we were totally just learning as we went.
That's pretty cool. I like the stories of, hey, let's. I just want to talk a little bit more. It seems like a lot of these podcasts or some of these are born out of, I have an interest, and let's go a little deeper, as you mentioned. So as far as evolution goes, when did you start? Was it always? When did you know you wanted to be guest driven and not just talk about the stories, or you wanted to bring in additional voices?
I mean, we were always guest driven. I don't think that we ever considered doing anything else. I mean, just because John and I know so many fantasy and science fiction authors, and we were just excited to be able to talk to them. I mean, actually, the first guest we had was this guy, Chet Falasek. He was the lead writer on the Left 4 Dead zombie shooter video game. And John was just addicted to Left 4 Dead, and he just couldn't stop talking about it. So, I mean, we selected that guest basically just because that was somebody John wanted to talk to. And we did do the podcast. It was really like a labor of love. I mean, we never expected to be doing it for very long. We never expected to make any money off of it at all. We just did it because we wanted to talk to, we wanted to be able to get people on the phone and talk to them basically whose work we were excited about.
Oh, sounds like the same reason I do my show.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah. Interesting. Okay. So, like, as I mentioned earlier, like I say I'm not really into sci-fi traditionally, but so sci-fi, I guess, is such a broad term, and then there's fantasy. I guess there's different layers. Can you define what science fiction is, at least in your mind, or what's your definition of science fiction?
Well, so there's this broad category of speculative fiction, which is basically stories that have some major divergence from reality, And then, so within speculative fiction, I mean, you have fantasy and horror and science fiction. And so the distinction, sort of the most easy distinction to make between fantasy and science fiction, is that science fiction stories are stories in which it's assumed that the rules of physics, that as we know them, are basically the same. Although they may get bent a lot, but it's basically set in the sort of scientific universe that we live in. Whereas a fantasy story, there could be magic or, genies and all sorts of, supernatural things like that. And then horror is kind of related to fantasy, but it's intended primarily to evoke fear in the audience. And people argue endlessly over these definitions, and it gets very hard. There are a lot of cases where it's hard to say, like, so I mean, telepathy, for example, is commonly thought of as a science fictional trope, but it really has no scientific basis, things like that. But, some of these things, or time travel or faster than light travel, it's very questionable whether they have much scientific basis, but they're all thought of as being science fiction. So George R. R. Martin, who wrote Game of Thrones, has what he calls the furniture theory of genre, which is basically that what determines what genre something is very surface level, superficial characteristics. Like, do the people have swords? Are there castles? Then it's fantasy. Are there robots and spaceships? Then it's science fiction. And I think the truth is somewhere in the middle there.
That's interesting because it was robots and what else was it that he said was
spaceships.
Robots.
Aliens.
So I'm not into robots, spaceships, and aliens. Like that has generally never, like, that's what I have not been into. I do like horror, excuse me, for the most part. I don't mind getting scared. Not the super gory stuff necessarily, but I don't mind a good horror flick. And in fantasy, I think fantasy might be the like I don't watch Game of Thrones because I would look at that and say, oh man, I can't get into that. You know, I even though literally everyone I know is a fan of the show and watches it and tells me, you know, from everyone I know likes it, but I just have that initial, I don't know what it is about me that I just have this barrier. But you know, I've also, you know, I've never seen, we had on Kevin Avery, you know, writer for John Oliver last week tonight with John Oliver, and does the Denzel Washington is the greatest actor of all time period podcast and comedian. Anyway, we had him on and we were talking, and he was shocked that I'd never seen Star Wars, and to me it kind of falls in that same vein too. Now, I'm not completely ignorant to Star Wars as I said in that episode. Like I know most of the characters in the storyline. Like I get it, but as far as having actual sat down and watched the film from the opening, you know, credits there when the words are coming up on the screen to I don't know what happens at the end, but so anyway, so I've never seen that. So I guess that's just my long way of saying I don't know what it is about that specific piece of the genre that I just don't get, because as we talked about, so where does like a show with like Black Mirror fall in? Because, you know, I'm able to suspend reality. Obviously, I love a good story, and those shows or episodes they're generally so varied. But so where does that fall on the spectrum of? And I love you said it was speculative. What was the first term you used?
Yeah, speculative fiction.
Speculative fiction. See, I've never heard that one. So I like that broad term because I can feel like, okay, I'm into certain aspects of speculative fiction, just maybe not the sci-fi aspect of it. Like, where does a show like Black Mirror fall into that topic?
I mean, I would certainly describe Black Mirror as a science fiction show, but the science fiction elements are pretty light. I mean, for the most part, the worlds look like our world in those episodes. Right. So yeah, I think that's much easier to get into for people who, you know, who are more attached to the real world and not, you know, crazy made up stuff. I think that. What am I trying to say? I think that Black Mirror sort of falls into what we would call dystopian fiction, which is dark images of the future. You know, it's the opposite of utopian fiction. And dystopian fiction has become very, very popular, particularly in young adult fiction in recent years. And I think dystopian fiction is, you know, easier for people to get into than in other genres like space opera or things like that have more, you know, you have to suspend your disbelief more. Dystopian fiction, you only have to suspend your disbelief a little bit, and you just think, oh, this seems pretty close to the world I know. And if things just get a little bit worse, we could fall into this darker world that the show's about.
Okay, that's good. I think that explained it extremely well. Okay, so let's talk about you and your specific interest, if you can kind of cite that. You know, I'll be cliche. I believe your father was a physicist, right? So that seems like the perfect lead into a life of someone maybe into sci-fi, or, you know, at least the science aspect that may jump off. I don't have any idea if that is if that would be like a classic story for you. But where do you think your initial interest in science fiction or speculative fiction comes from?
No, I mean, there's no question that I picked up my love of fantasy and science fiction from my parents. My parents are both professional scientists. And all the books that they read.
Well, I don't want to discount your mom. Yeah. I didn't have that note. Okay, so she's all right.
Yeah, and so all the books that they read to me growing up were all fantasy and science fiction books. You know, like The Hobbit and Robert Heinlein and Ray Bradbury and authors like that. And I was just always into writing. I think I was just born a writer because, you know, from as early as I can remember, I was putting together books and drawing books. And I would tell my mom, you know, before I learned how to read, I would tell my mom what I wanted the words to say because, you know, I didn't know how to write at that time.
Right.
And so, yeah, so I just grew up in this house where, you know, and my dad had wanted to be a science fiction writer. And that's why he got into studying physics. And then he just became a physicist. But he always had that love for the field. And so I just grew up in this environment where it was just sort of taken for granted that being a science fiction writer was one of the most amazing things that you could do. And so I definitely absorbed that. And obviously, you know, as you know, the wider society often sees writing science fiction as sort of nerdy or weird or not too cool and things like that. But because I
Right.
grew up in this particular household, I always just thought of it as just the most amazing thing that anyone could ever want to do.
Yeah, if it's normal to you, for lack of a better term, of course it's normal. It's just an interest, really, really. But if it's what you're into, that's interesting. So that's a good mix of nature versus nurture, I guess.
Yeah, yeah.
But certainly a good amount of nurture. So let me ask you: do you think there's any type of philosophical value that science fiction brings society, in your opinion, being able to suspend that disbelief, or maybe even seek that utopia and or dystopia, or anything else that people gather from that? Do you think there's any particular value that brings to society?
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is why I'm so interested in science fiction, because I am very philosophically minded. And, I studied mostly political philosophy in college. And definitely the aspect of science fiction that appeals to me the most is what I call the thought experiment aspect. The idea of, if this were true, what would the implications of that be? And I think it's very important for people to be able to imagine other societies, because how are we ever going to get to a better society if we can't imagine what the alternatives are? And so I just
Right.
think that science fiction is so important for just expanding the range of your imagination. And I really feel like people who don't read science fiction, a lot of times I find, will dismiss anything new or different out of hand, that they're just very attached to the world that they're familiar with. And if you suggest that, society should be structured in some dramatically different way, or technology might change society in some dramatic way, they'll just be like, no, that's wrong. And they can't even articulate what would be wrong about it. And I think that science fiction is so important then for just expanding what people are comfortable with, and also just getting people to think about the future, because I think that most people don't think much about the future in terms of what's the world going to be like in 100 years or 1,000 years. And
Right.
we're making choices, right? We're really at a critical moment in history where we're making choices that are going to determine whether there is human civilization in 100 years or 1,000 years. And so it's really important that we get these things right. And so I think it's really important for as many people as possible to be thinking about the future and thinking about what choices we should be making, because the stakes are so high right now.
I think you're exactly right as you mentioned that. So it got me to thinking about like the book 1984 that's often cited, and I guess that would be dystopia, right?
Yeah, that's by
Uh,
George Orwell. That's a classic example of dystopian literature, sure.
as you were talking, I was thinking about my love of the Terminator, at least the first two, and I was
Yeah.
like, well, I guess that certainly would fall in. That's definitely a robot. For I guess a cyborg is a robot, and then it got me to thinking about, when you watch these old movies and read these old books, that yeah, they definitely are bringing a light on to what could happen in society, because some of those things did actually are coming true, to a certain extent. So I don't know if you agree with that or those specific instances, but that's what I got to think about when you were just speaking there.
Well, no, absolutely. I mean, 1984 is a classic example of cautionary fiction, right? Where it's presenting a future for the purpose of saying we don't want this future. Let's try to avoid this. And I think that 1984, by giving people such a powerful image of a totalitarian society, has helped us avoid that to some extent. I mean, unfortunately, we seem to be kind of drifting ever closer to 1984 with the surveillance state and everything. But I think certainly the world is a much better place for having that book in it. And the Terminator too. I mean, that's one of a really pressing issue right now is AI, right? Are we going to have our machines going to become smarter than us, and what's going to happen as a result of that? People sometimes talk about this in terms of being called the technological singularity, when technology, when machines start inventing new technology, and then we can't even imagine how advanced the technology is going to get, because machines that are smarter than us are going to be inventing the technology. And will we even have a place still in that world? And, apparently if you poll AI researchers, they think that there will be computers that are as smart as human beings in 20 years. And this seems to be a prediction. People have had this prediction for decades that in 20 years we'll have machines that are as smart as people, and it has never come true. And I'm a little skeptical that it will come true in 20 years, but it very easily could be. And I mean, that's the kind of time horizon we're potentially looking at for dealing with some of these issues. I mean, you look at the Watson computer that beat Ken Jennings at Jeopardy. The best Jeopardy player was beaten by a computer. I mean, if a computer can beat the best, if a computer can beat the Jeopardy champion at Jeopardy, a computer can beat anyone at anything, given enough engineers working on programming that computer, right?
Right.
And so this is a whole other issue of like, what jobs is anyone going to have in the future if you can just program a computer to do anyone's job? But yeah, so movies like Terminator, I think, have done a really good job of just raising awareness among just, casual viewers of, machines in the future is something we need to be thinking about.
Yeah, it's definitely, because it's funny because I love the Google. I don't know what you call it, where you ask Google. I don't know, whatever it is, where I hit the microphone and I can ask Google darn near anything, and it answers pretty well, random stuff, and so I'm always, not always, but sometimes I'm just awed by that, and I'm like, this advancement, and that's just one small piece, obviously, probably in the grand scheme of things, it's not that, but everything's intuitive and predictive. I'm getting a little worried now about these machines. I want to shut down the computers. So we'll shift a little bit here, because you mentioned writing and growing up with a lot of books and stories, and you're interested in writing. So I know you have an MFA in screenwriting, which I think is very cool, actually. I didn't know that about you until I looked that up. So I think that's awesome. And then, so I think that just helps obviously show your love and interest in writing. And I know you teach writing as well. But so do you miss writing? I don't know how much you get to write now, but do you miss writing? How much do you write currently?
No, unfortunately, I don't really have time to write right now. I mean, doing a weekly show where I read a book every week and interview the author about it, and I do all the editing and all the stuff. I write the blog posts for Wired.com every week, and I'm just I'm so busy. I don't have time. I have to schedule like an hour to watch a movie with my girlfriend, or, per week or something. Right. So the writing has really fallen by the wayside right now. As I said, when we started the podcast, I didn't think we would be doing it for that long. And it's, obviously now I've been doing it for 7 years, but I always figured I can get back to writing once this podcast thing falls apart, as I figured it inevitably would. But now I'm actually making a living, a modest living off of the podcast. And
oh my gosh, what's that like?
Well, it's amazing. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, before anyone gets too excited, I mean, I'm making about as much as maybe I would be making as a adjunct professor, which unfortunately is not very much. But just right. It's thrilling to be able to. I mean, I work full time on the podcast. I wake up at 5 a.m. and I work on it until 11 or 12 when I go to bed, and I just do that pretty much, as I was saying, 7 days a week. And I just wake up every morning with a big smile on my face because I can't wait to read whatever book I need to read or interview whatever author I've been dying to talk to. It's so great. And I'm able to do this mostly thanks to the Patreon support that we've gotten. We have about 200 listeners who are supporting us on Patreon right now, which is where the majority of the money comes from. And so I'm just so grateful to everyone who's signed up to do that, because, a show like this about books, where I actually read all the books before I interview the authors, it takes a lot of time to do, and I couldn't do it without that kind of support.
Yeah, I know how much work that is, reading the books before you have someone on. I understand. It's a lot of work. It's funny, I saw you, I posted the other day on Twitter that editing the show is a labor of love, but I'm starting to question how much I actually love it. And I feel like that's a sentiment that you'd agree with, especially if you're reading through sometimes I make it through the whole book, and sometimes I don't. I try to get enough that I can intelligently speak about the book when I have an author on. I know that's a lot of work.
Yeah, I mean, I used to have a rule that I had to read at least the first half of the book. And particularly with a novel, I think that's usually fine, because you're probably not going to talk about the second half of a novel during the interview because you don't want to spoil it for people. Right. But I've gotten into I've gotten enough discipline and gotten into enough of a pattern where I've actually read the entire book for every interview that I've done for, I think, about 2 years now. And now I don't want to break that streak. But yeah, the editing is really grueling. And I think most people who haven't done it, you just can't imagine how time consuming it is. I used to love actually doing the editing because, when I was writing is very frustrating in the sense that you never know if you're doing it right or not. And you can work all day and then you're like, that sucks. And you throw it all out. Whereas with editing, you're almost always making it better. So there's this very, rewarding sense of accomplishment that every 5 minutes you're putting into editing is making it 5 minutes better. And so I used to be really kind of addicted to that feeling. But now that I've been on such a grind for so many years, the editing is starting to. I am, my love for the editing is starting to attenuate somewhat.
No, I hear you, brother. When you're, do you still feel like you're crafting a narrative through your podcast, through your editing, and obviously, since you don't have the time to write stories, but do you still feel like you're still kind of structuring that narrative when you're producing your show?
Well, yeah, and I've gotten really I try to structure. I actually, fortunately these days, I don't have to edit a ton for content. I mean, for the first 5 or 6 years, I had to edit out about half of each episode because it just wasn't good, But I finally developed enough of a system as an interviewer that I pretty much get people to say what I want, or say the kinds of things I want, and I don't have to cut out, stuff that's not that good so much. But I do try to structure each interview to have, I think of it like a story with a climax and, with an inciting incident and rising action and a climax and a denouement. And I have basically a template that I use pretty much for the interviews. And, I'll usually go in with a plan. Like in the first third, we're going to talk about this subject. In the second third, we're going to talk about this subject. And in at the end, we'll wrap things up with a couple of these things. And so, the interviews do almost always have a really nice structure to them where, they make sense. It's not just jumping all over the place. And so I do try to bring a little bit of that narrative sense, that I picked up from writing fiction.
All right. As you kind of know, I think you listened to a couple episodes. We talk to a lot of writers and storytellers on the show, and I like to pick their brains, about how they craft those stories and all that. But I saw in an old interview you mentioned an Odyssey Writers Workshop from I think it was way back in 2001, and you talked about what you had kind of learned there and how I don't know if it changed your way of writing, but do you recall that Writers Workshop?
Yeah, I certainly remember the workshop. I mean, I've attended a bunch of fantasy and science fiction writing workshops in addition to the graduate program you mentioned. But I mean, Clarion is the big one. It's a 6-week summer workshop, and Odyssey is similar. It's another 6-week summer workshop, and I went to a couple other ones. But yeah, Odyssey is run by this woman, Jean Cavellis. She used to be an editor in New York City, and she really teaches you systematically different writing skills. And so at that time, my writing was really weak on introspection, right? So getting inside the head of a character. This is when writing from the third person point of view. This is maybe a little technical, but when you're writing in the third person point of view where your viewpoint character, you're referring to him as he or she or whatever, it's actually kind of weird and unnatural if you're not practiced at it to get inside, to write what that character's thinking from outside, in a sense, that character. And so that was one big thing she pointed out to me. And another big thing she pointed out to me was that I had passive characters. And this is a big problem, especially now, as you mentioned, that I teach writing to high school and college age students that I see, because most writers tend to have sort of passive personalities where we're not the life of the party. We're the one standing in the corner watching what everyone's doing. And so when we write fiction, we tend to tell the story from the point of view of someone who's standing in the corner watching what's going on. And the problem with that is that the people who are standing in the corner watching what's going on tend not to be the most exciting people to read about. So really most of the time, it's better to have an active character, a character who has something that they really want and that they're working toward achieving, and figuring their way out of problems and things like that. And so those were the two technical issues that the Odyssey Writing Workshop really helped me address.
I don't know if it was that same time or not, but I think you spent a lot of time rewriting or retyping certain books too.
Yeah. So actually, at Odyssey, Jean Cavello said that in order to pick up some of these technical skills, you should just take a piece of fiction that you like. She was thinking a short story, and retype it, because that will force you to pay attention to the words on the page. Because usually, when you're reading a story, if it's any good, you fall into the world of the story. And you're not really seeing the words. You're living the lives of these characters, and so you can read, as I had, you can read hundreds and hundreds of books, and someone could ask you, well, how long were the paragraphs, or how long were the sentences, how many clauses did they have, and you would have no idea because you were never paying attention to that sort of thing. So and when I was at Odyssey, one of my classmates recommended Game of Thrones to me, the original novel by George R. R. Martin. And so I read it and I loved it, and I just finished reading that book, and I thought, well, if rewriting a short story is good, rewriting a whole novel would be even better. And this novel is just doing everything I want a novel to do. So I'm just going to rewrite this whole book. And I said, if typing it would be good, how about doing it by hand? That would be even better, because I was already typing a lot of stuff and I wanted a change, give my carpal tunnel, risk lessen that risk. And so, so I just got Game of Thrones, and I got a spiral notebook and a pen and just started copying out the book. And I did about, 2 pages or something, and my hands cramped up. And I just thought, this is crazy. I can't do this whole book. So I resolved I would just do the first 100 pages. That seemed good enough. But then I got to the first 100 pages, and I was having so much fun, and I was learning so much that I kept going, and I ended up doing the whole book. And then I ended up doing a whole bunch of other books too over the next couple of years.
Conclusively, what was it? Could you sum up what that may have done for your writing, the rewriting of those? Are there any specific takeaways that you mentioned what it's meant to do, but for you personally, having done that, especially with so many books, when the initial theory was, are any specific takeaways from that? Yeah, well,
one specific takeaway, this is again a little bit technical, but I started paying a lot of attention to pronouns. So, he, she, it, because a lot of sentences, you get confused. You don't really realize it as you're reading it why, but you're sort of confused about what's going on and you don't know why. But if you really study it carefully, you realize it's because the pronoun usage is ambiguous, where the author has said he or it or she, and it's not clear which he or she or it they're referring to, because there are a couple he or she's or it's around. And if an author is careless about that kind of stuff, it does the thing. There's you just kind of lose focus and you get a little bit confused, and you go back. You're like, wait, what was going on? And so I resolved, as a result of that, to just really try to be as clear as possible about what every pronoun I was using was referring to. And just the other thing, my natural writing style is I use a lot of dialogue and a lot of action and a lot of short sentences. And it was just really striking for me to go through Game of Thrones and just see how long some of the paragraphs of description were, how long some of the, when you jump into someone's head and you're going through their feelings about what's happened over years, how long some of those things were. And to just really think I need to not just rely so much on action, dialogue, but really get inside people's heads, really put myself in the scenes, and really provide a rich textural experience for the reader. Textured experience for the reader.
I like you explaining that. I'm fascinated with writers, so I like hearing the technical, what you guys have learned over the years and what you bring. And so as I was talking about earlier, that it seems like you're asked a lot about the future of podcasting and where it's going. I think I kind of know your answer there. So I want to ask you though more about, so for writers and self-publishing in 2016, where do you kind of see that landscape currently, and do you see anything different on the horizon for people who want to self-publish, both new and old? I guess fiction writers specifically, but I don't know if it works for both fiction and nonfiction. But do you have any thoughts on self-publishing in this new paradigm?
Well, yeah, we did an episode a while ago on self-publishing, and I would really recommend anyone who's interested in the topic go listen to that. We had Hugh Howey, who's an incredibly successful self-published author. He did Wool. And it's just making an incredible living. He's now on a yacht sailing around the world. He was working in a bookstore. He was a clerk in a bookstore and self-published his science fiction stories on Amazon.com, and is now sailing around the world on a yacht. And also my good friend Tobias Backel was on that episode, and he's very savvy about all that stuff, and as always. And I think also a good thing about Toby is he's clear-eyed about both the upsides and the downsides of self-publishing. I think with self-publishing, there tends to be a little bit of almost like a messianic feeling about it, that this is the new truth, sort of a cultish aspect about it. We're going to overthrow the old paradigm, and everyone's going to live in a land of plenty where we're all famous and stuff like that. And that isn't the reality.
That sounds like podcasting, but go ahead.
Yeah. With self-publishing, it's a classic long tail scenario where you have a couple of people who are making lots of money, and then that drops almost to zero, and then is basically at zero out to the horizon, right? So most people in both traditional publishing and in self-publishing are not making much money off of it, and there's just a few successes that everyone is striving to be. And I think that increasingly self-publishing and traditional publishing and crowdfunding and all these things are all different revenue streams, and you're going to want to have as many of them as you can, because you never know when one of them is going to dry up. So that's what Toby does, is, he publishes some books traditionally with big publishers. He publishes some with himself online, and he does different crowdfunding projects, and I really think that, in the future, writers are going to need to be more business oriented, more entrepreneurial, and seeking out those sorts of opportunities and being flexible and moving from opportunity to opportunity. Sort of like like it used to be, you could just get a job and work for the same company your whole life, and you didn't have to worry about it so much. It used to be you could just, publish a book with a big publisher and then keep doing that for your whole career. And I think that that's just increasingly not the case.
Okay. Got to go the alternate routes, but do it intelligently and be realistic. Definitely people should check out that episode for sure. My producer who you talked to, Deanne, she wanted to know if you were familiar with Octavia Butler.
Well, sure, of course. Yeah, I mean, Octavia Butler is a great science fiction author. She was actually she received a MacArthur Genius Grant for her work. She's a Black female science fiction author. For a long time, I think she was the only prominent Black female science fiction author. She's well known for books like Kindred. She's written stories sort of involving time travel and slavery and those sorts of themes. She has an incredible short story collection called Bloodchild and Other Stories. And there are two stories from that really stick out in my mind. There's a story where aliens have taken over Earth and they use humans to carry their offspring. So it's sort of like the movie Aliens a little bit, where, they implant alien fetuses inside humans, and then humans have to be pregnant with them, basically, and then give birth to them. And she has another story where some sort of virus has infected everybody, and it attacks the speech centers of the brain. And so everyone can no longer communicate with speech. And there's one woman, and she's not affected by this virus in the same way everyone is. And so she can still speak, but she can't speak out loud, because if she reveals that she can still speak, everyone just attacks her because they're so furious and jealous that she still has that capability.
Wow. Okay.
There's a biography of Octavia Butler that just came out this month that I'm hoping to discuss on the show. There's this new series. I think it's the University of Illinois Press, but it's called Modern Masters of Science Fiction. So I interviewed the author of the Frederick Pohl book a month or two ago, and I'm really looking forward to talking about more books in the series. Hopefully the Octavia Butler one. There's also an Alfred Bester one that's coming out soon. But yeah, so that's Octavia Butler. I'm certainly familiar with her, and she's certainly a major author that everyone should check out.
I'm glad to know you're familiar with her. I, of course, was not. So I'm glad you got that immediate kind of dossier on her. I'm sure Deanne will be happy. And now I want to check out those short stories, especially the second one you were describing there about the woman that can't talk. That was sounding really interesting, is what I'm attempting to say.
Yeah.
But okay, so then I've got one other thing for you here. And I don't know where you'll fall on this, but because there's one thing that I see happening, and this happens in all forms or all genres, really. It's not unique to science fiction, I don't believe, but I see it, sometimes in science fiction, comic books, this opposition or this of fans, being resistant to people of color, usually Black, playing, some fantasy role. And I don't know how prevalent that is. Obviously there's certain cases that we could cite, but it feels like to me, with social media and the ability to kind of literally air all of your grievances without a filter and usually without much retribution, either you're Donald Trump or a guy who played Dungeons and Dragons a little too long. I'm just curious, because I think I've kind of seen you get into the dynamics of group bullying via social media, and I don't know if the two necessarily have one to do with the other, but I'd like to get your thoughts on that question. That was kind of long. Hopefully it made sense there.
Well, yeah, certainly this fantasy and science fiction field traditionally has been a very white field. There's just no getting around that. But that's changing very, very quickly. And a huge percentage of the exciting upcoming authors are people of color. And we've tried to, be on the right side of history with that. John and I, John has edited this series of special issues of his magazines where, you know, it would be like women destroy science fiction, people of color destroying science fiction, and queers destroy science fiction. And so we've done episodes talking about those. And, you know, we try to get writers of color on the show when we can. I mean, there's some, you know, I don't know if you're familiar with like Nowell Hopkinson or N.K. Jemisin, Dawn Johnson, Nadia Korafor, Nisi Shaw. I mean, there are a whole bunch. You could go through our... You can go through our archives.
I'm not familiar, but I should familiarize myself probably with some of them.
Yeah, no, I would really encourage people. And Tobias Bakel, I mentioned, we had an episode where Junot Diaz came on and talked about some of these issues with him that was really interesting. But yeah, there is this issue you say where people online will complain where they, you know, if Spider-Man's going to be black or Roland Deschain from The Dark Tower is going to be black. I think Harry Potter. There was. I can't think of her name. In the stage play, Hermione Granger was played by a black actress.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I'm totally in favor of that. It's Idris Elba is going to be playing Roland Deschain in The Dark Tower. I'm really excited about that. He's an unbelievable actor. So yeah, I mean, I think, you know, I mean, there's just sort of like, obviously, I think, did you mention Donald Trump? I mean, there's sort of this wider cultural phenomenon of people who've had a privileged position for a long time and are losing their grip on that and are lashing out. And I'm not with those people, you know.
Of course, yeah. And I don't necessarily expect you to speak for them either. But yeah, I was just curious, just from that standpoint of it happens in literally every genre, every whatever society, sci-fi or comic, nerdy, geeky, whatever words you want to use to describe some fans of the broad sci-fi genre. So it's good to know that, you know, there is so much happening in diversity and so much other options out there. I think that's one thing too that perhaps I would be more interested if I was more aware of people of color who are producing science fiction. It makes sense, of course, that they do, but you know, the promotion or even just, you know, I'm not in places where those conversations are being had. So it's nice to have your show as a resource for those things, not just, you know, for people of color, but cover it all broadly, but also go deep, as you mentioned initially. So, all right. I'm sorry.
Oh, could I just say? I mean, I think that there's no question that the genre has put forward a face in the past that was deeply alienating to people of color, right? I mean, oftentimes characters who were described as people of color in the text of a book would be shown as white on the cover of the book. You know, like I have a good friend of mine from New York City is this guy, Rob Bland. And he was always into science fiction and horror movies as a kid, and he would try to get his friends to go with him. And he said the response he would get is they would say, oh, well, how are they going to kill the brother this time? Because the black guy always dies first in all these movies. And so I really think that it's incumbent on fantasy and science fiction creators to not to perpetuate those sorts of patterns, and to try to do more to bring people in, because as I said, the future is riding on these decisions that we're going to make as a society, and we can't be excluding huge portions of our society from these ideas and these narratives. And so yeah, but I think that's changing really quickly, and I'm optimistic, certainly, for the future.
Okay, good. All right. Well, optimism for the future. That utopia versus dystopia, right? I don't know if I'm using those correctly.
No, it's good. That's good.
Okay, cool. All right. Well, good. All right. I think that's a good note to wrap on then. Some optimism for the future. Dave, I really appreciate you coming on. Appreciate your time this morning. I know you're busy, but probably taking away from you knee deep in a book or editing a show. So I'll let you get back to that. Thanks so much for coming on. So, I got to get a liner from you, and then, but how can people get a hold of you? I'm sure your show's everywhere podcasts are found, but.
Well, yeah, sure. I mean, so the podcast we've been talking about, it's called Geeks Guide to the Galaxy, and we have a website at geeksguideshow.com, and we're on Twitter at geeksgalaxy, and I'm David Barr Kirtley, and if you want to read any of my short stories, I have a website at davidbarkirtley.com, and you can read almost everything that I publish there for free, and I'm also on Twitter at Dave Barr Kirtley. So, follow me, friend me. I'd really appreciate it.
Hey, we really appreciate it. Last thing I'll get from you is our liner. So you know how to do that. If you identify your, I say I'm sure you know how to do it, and I give you instructions. Yeah, so just in case, identify yourself. You can say you're part of the vocal minority. That would be greatly appreciated.
Yeah. All right, so I'm David Barr Kirtley, host of the Geeks Guide to the Galaxy podcast, and you're part of the vocal minority.
Awesome. Appreciate it, man. Thank you very much.
Hey, welcome back. Hope you enjoyed that conversation with David Barr Kirtley. First, let me say I apologize for the audio. I know I sounded like I was in a tin can for a lot of the interview. There was an issue with mono versus stereo in my recording, and I actually recorded that in not my usual studio in or outside of Dallas. I was in Oklahoma at our t-shirt factory. Shout out to Cutesy Custom Kids, our partner there. But I think you got to hear the most important person in the conversation. That certainly was Dave, and his insight and perspective. Really, I feel like he was like my podcast kindred spirit there for a while. So thank everybody for checking it out. I want to say that today's music was provided by Shy Wright, Audio Crack Music. My man is a genius. Really appreciate my man. Special thanks to our associate producer, Lizzie, or Deanne, as she may be commonly known. Thank you to everyone who listens and downloads. Appreciate it. Use the hashtag #TheVocalMinority. Go to audibletrial.com/vocal report. That's audibletrial.com/vocal report for your free audiobook. That's just another way you can help out the show. Go to the website, thevocalminorityReport.com. Check out the store. Get a shirt, support the show. We're adding new styles. Make sure you go to contribute, fill out our survey, do the Blue Apron thing. We're trying to get them as a full-time sponsor, but you can certainly get your deal on the meals that they have by going to the website. That's thevocalminorityReport.com. Go to store, go to contribute, guest info, go to iTunes, leave a rating, leave a review. Make sure you subscribe. Subscribe everywhere podcasts are found, anywhere you might be listening. We'll holler at you next episode. All power to the people. Peace.
This has been a Vocal Neighbors production.